Thank you, John, and good morning. The development of new drugs is unquestionably expensive, time-consuming, and risky. And that is so for cancer drug development in particular, with especially high per patient cost and lengthy development times. Our center has tracked drug development and regulatory metrics since the mid-1970s with data back to the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Cosmetics Act. Some of our projects have elicited data on very micro aspects of the clinical development process, but much of our work is at a more macro level. The metrics, though, can convey information that significantly impact the economics of new drug development. So what I would like to do this morning, in the way of background, is share with you some of our recent analyses of the drug development and regulatory review processes with a special emphasis on the oncology class. Here we go. Okay, so here's an outline of the talk. I'll show what we know about cancer drug approval trends in relation to approvals for other therapeutic classes. I'll then discuss what we have found about the technical risks for oncology drug development, in part in contrast to other therapeutic areas. I will also break down the overall cancer drug risk data by molecule type and general cancer type for a project that we have recently completed but have not yet published. I'll then show what we have found about cancer drug clinical development times in relation to other therapeutic classes and do the same for the FDA regulatory review period. I'll finally show some data on the extent to which cancer drugs have been included in some of the special designation categories that the FDA has to help speed development and review. That will also be done in comparison to non-oncology drugs. Okay, let's look first at trends in the main output of the drug development process, new drug and biologics approvals. These data show the trends for 3 decades in FDA approval of NMEs and therapeutically significant biologics. You can see the notable increases over time in new compound approvals for cancer drugs. They more than tripled from the 1980s to the 1990s. They increased another 24% from the 1990s to the 2000s, averaging 4.7 approvals per year. And actually, the number of these data go through 2009, but actually the number of anti-cancer drugs in 2012 was more than twice the average annual rate for the 2000s. And there were a number of cancer-related approvals last year as well. Looking at other major classes in contrast, anti-infective approvals, excluding AIDS antivirals, declined steadily, dropping 41% from the 1980s to the 2000s. And that's also an important public health issue as multi-drug resistant strains are on the increase. Cardiovascular drugs dropped 34% from the 1990s to the 2000s, although the absolute number in the 2000s was still slightly higher than that for anti-neoplastics. In short, though, despite the problems that developers face in getting anti-cancer drugs approved, the interest in the development, as judged by the number of approvals, has increased over time. We can also look not just at approvals, but at the number of drugs in the clinical testing pipeline. And at the Tufts Center, we have often looked at technical risk in new drug development. That is the likelihood of success or failure in getting new drugs through the development and regulatory review processes. And these data are from a recent project on cancer drug development risks, where we try to capture all cancer drugs in clinical development, or that initiated clinical development in the period here. That's why and we need a lengthy period of time to let those drugs go through the development and regulatory approval process before we can determine whether they're failures or successes. But even for this period going up to 2004, these are for drugs entering the clinical testing pipeline up to then. The figure shows that the number of new cancer drugs first tested in humans exhibited a sharp upward trend, with the number of drugs in development increasing approximately 75% over the period. So this is further evidence of increasing interest in cancer drug development, despite all the problems that have been alluded to thus far. Now, here are the estimated phase transition probabilities and overall clinical approval success rate that we found for all investigational cancer drugs that we could find over the study period, over 600 drugs. The likelihood of moving from phase 2 to phase 3 or phase 3 to regulatory approval is under 50%. And the estimated probability of marketing approval for a cancer compound that enters the clinical testing pipeline here is estimated to be just 13%. Now, in a previous study, we had estimated overall clinical approval success rates by therapeutic class for investigational drugs that had entered the clinical testing pipeline in the same period. And these are compounds, there's a slightly more restricted set. These are compounds that were in the pipelines at some point of the top 50 biopharmaceutical companies. And so we can see substantial variation in success rates by therapeutic class, success rate of 24% for systemic anti-infectives, but very low success rates, lower than even for cancer drugs, for cardiovascular and CNS drugs. Okay. This is from the new, as I said, as yet unpublished study, where we focused on all cancer drugs entering the pipeline during the period listed. And we have the phase transition probabilities and overall approval success rates here, broken down by molecule type, biologics or small molecules. And unlike what we've actually seen for biologics in general, which as a whole tend to have higher success rates than small molecule drugs, there wasn't much difference. In fact, they're estimated to be slightly lower. Success rate is estimated to be slightly lower here for the biologics. We also, there are lots of other results in our study, but it can only show a small number here. We also broke out success rates by general cancer type, either compounds that were investigated only in blood cancers or compounds that were investigated only in solid tumors. And we see a substantial difference between the two. The success rate for the hematologic only category was nearly 4 times as high as for the solid tumor category. So clearly differences there, differences across the board in getting drugs through the clinical testing pipeline through phases, but the difference was most striking for phase 3 to regulatory submission, where 87% of the hematologic drugs made that transition. Now, our center has tracked clinical development and approval time since, as I said, for drugs back to the early 1960s. So we can take a very long view of the length of the development and regulatory approval process. Here, I'm looking at the 2000s up to the most recent data that we have through 2011. And by clinical development times here, I mean the time from IND filing to submission of an application for approval with the FDA, an NDA or a BLA. We can see substantial differences across categories, particularly for CNS, which had the longest development periods, but anti-neoplastics were also quite high, and in fact increased a half a year from the first half of the period to the second half. So clearly, anti-neoplastic drug development, as I'm sure you're all aware, is quite a lengthy process, and it's lengthy in relation to, in general, to other drug classes. Now, of course, we also examined U.S. approval phase times. And here, approval time is the time from the initial submission of an NDA or BLA to the FDA to marketing approval for that compound. So, which might involve a number of review cycles. But this is the where the application is sent back to the manufacturer for further elaboration or further study. But this is the measure of the length of the whole process. And here we see, again, differences by category, and anti-neoplastic compounds had relatively low or relatively short clinical approval phase times. Now here we just sort of put the data together. That is the clinical data and the clinical development period data and the approval phase data to get the time from IND filing to NDA or BLA approval. And despite the shorter approval phase times, the approval phase is a relatively short part of the whole period here. So anti-neoplastics are still just second to CNS drugs in terms of the overall length of the process. And I should say the full clinical to approval process can be somewhat longer, since we're really only measuring here clinical development in the United States. For a lot of compounds, the initial clinical development occurs abroad, so that would, on average, increase the total time from the start of human testing anywhere to approval over and above what we see here. Okay, now how do cancer drugs do in the regulatory review process? Just sort of taking a little more micro view. One way to look at it is to examine the number of review cycles that an approved drug goes through before it gets approved. We did a study on FDA review cycles 3 or 4 years ago, and our study examined and controlled statistically for a number of factors associated with the likelihood of multiple review cycles in longer or shorter approval phase times. But without getting into all of the statistical results, let me just show some descriptive statistics for one factor that was associated with the likelihood of having a multiple cycle review, that is a therapeutic class. And we found that the number of review cycles varied significantly by class. And here we see that while a relatively high number of submissions for anti-infective and anti-neoplastic drugs were reviewed in one cycle, cardiovascular, GI, and especially CNS drugs had relatively low shares of their submissions reviewed in only one cycle. So the study doesn't prove why some classes had high or low first cycle review shares, but we might speculate why. For example, anti-infective submissions may be relatively simple and straightforward, and anti-neoplastic drug sponsors may have had a lot of interactions with the FDA prior to approval. On the other hand, efficacy outcomes for CNS drugs are not easily defined and measured, so that could affect the results for CNS drugs. So, but anyway, by this measure, cancer compounds did relatively well. Now, in the fall, our center published a report on oncology drug development that showed, among other things, that cancer compounds look very different compared to other therapeutic classes when it comes to taking advantage of some of the FDA special programs to help speed development and review. Here we see that the share of compounds that were in the fast track or accelerated approval programs is much higher for oncology compounds than for compounds in other classes. There was a decline, though, actually, for both oncology and other classes over the last 5-year period. With regard to orphan drug designation, about half of the approved oncology compounds had been given an orphan designation for the approved indication, much higher than is the case for non-cancer drugs. Now, one interesting finding in the report is that for approved oncology compounds in the most recent period analyzed, this 5-year period, special designation status was not associated with shorter approval times. That held for both FDA and EMA approvals, with the EC, exceptional circumstances designation, used by the EMA. The FDA approval phase times for the FDA, though, are relatively low. And one explanation is the fact that an overwhelming proportion of cancer compounds get a priority review rating from the FDA. So the FDA gives priority review ratings to compounds that are thought to represent significant gains over existing therapy. And in doing so, under the PDUFA legislation, the FDA must commit to quicker review times for an FDA action with respect to an application for a marketing approval. So if we look at approved drugs that have gotten priority review ratings from the FDA by therapeutic class, we can see here there are substantial differences in the degree to which new compounds with marketing applications submitted to the FDA obtain priority review ratings. Overall, 45% of new compounds approved by the FDA during the 2000s received a priority review rating. However, 3/4 or more of the AIDS antivirals and anti-neoplastic compounds receive priority review status. Of course, on the other hand, only about 1 in 5 of the CNS drugs approved in the 2000s got priority review status. Incidentally, the higher percentage of CNS drugs that receive the standard review rating does not fully explain the higher than average approval phase times for that class. Even CNS drugs that had received a priority review rating had relatively long approval phase time. Okay, to summarize, cancer drug development is very risky, although the risk is greater in some therapeutic classes and less in others. We found that cancer development risks did not vary by molecule type, but did by general cancer type. Clinical development times for cancer drugs are lengthy, but they go through the regulatory review process relatively quickly. Nonetheless, the total time, clinical development plus regulatory approval phases is still quite substantial. Compared to other therapeutic classes, a relatively large number of cancer compounds receive an orphan drug designation, obtain fast track and accelerated approval designations, and are given priority review status by the FDA. However, the most recent data that we have analyzed show that the regulatory approval phase is not any shorter for oncology drugs for having obtained a special designation status. There's no doubt that oncology drug development is challenging, and we need efficiency improvements to lower costs, speed development, and regulatory review, and reduce risks in this critical therapeutic class. Thank you.